Good evening, everyone. Apologies for my slightly late arrival. I had internet problems, but I managed to connect. First of all, thank you so much, as always, for joining. Very nice to see everyone here. Simon, nice to see you here after your hosting the bingo game. Thank you very much for that. I hope I managed to share as much information in this year as you did in the bingo game. So today's shiur is based upon a section of Parshat Massei, the second of our double sedras this week, which deals with the borders of Eretz Yisrael. Now, the issue of the borders of Eretz Yisrael is doubly complicated, and I want to use the time available to try and look at two aspects, two complications of the borders. The first complication is technical and geographic, which is that the delineation of the borders as described in the Torah is not always that clear-cut. It's sometimes a little difficult to translate into modern locations, geographic locations, and that's one problem, one challenge with addressing the borders of Eretz Yisrael. And the second issue is that we have a wealth of information, too much information. We have the borders in this week's Sedra, in Parshat Massei, which delineate the area of Eretz Yisrael. But then we have other delineations, other descriptions of the lands of Eretz Yisrael. In particular, we have the description in Parshas Lech Lecha, in the Bris Bein HaBesarim, when Avram was promised Eretz Yisrael. And there's a very different description of the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael in that particular Parsha there. And finally, there's a third set of way of defining Eretz Yisrael, which is the Eretz Yisrael of the Second Temple era, the second Beis HaMikdash, which affects the geography of Eretz Yisrael from a halachic point of view for Trumas and Masras, for the various agricultural halachas that apply in the land of Israel, whether it's the tithing of Truma or whether it's the Shemitah law. So I call this shiur the three lands of Israel, the three Eretz Yisraels, because there's actually three ways of defining Eretz Yisrael based upon three different halachic sources. And how these halachic sources work together and which sources are the relevant ones for which halachas is really not always entirely clear. And we're not going to have time in this shiur to go through all three descriptions of Eretz Yisrael. I'll try and cover as many as I can, but we'll definitely go through some of them. And in the source sheet, I gave sources about all three definitions of Eretz Yisrael, because I think this is something worth looking at, even though we're not able to cover it all ourselves. Now, working out the borders of Eretz Yisrael is of crucial interest. It's vital importance. It's potentially important for halachic reasons. When and where am I living that will fulfill the mitzvahs of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael? There's a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. If I live in some of the more outlying regions of Eretz Yisrael, if I live in the far south, in Eilat, am I fulfilling the mitzvahs of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael? Maybe even if I live in Gaza, is that included in Eretz Yisrael? And similarly, it's of halachic significance when it comes to the hechsher system in Israel. Which farmed produce do the hechsher, the kashrus authorities, have to monitor for Shemitah, for Truma and Maaseh, and which ones can they say, no, this is Chutz La'aretz, even though this is perhaps in the borders of the modern day state of Israel, and therefore the laws of Trumas and Maaseh wouldn't apply. So this is both a current halachic issue, particularly comes to the fore in Shemitah, when farmers need to know whether their farms are in Israel or outside Israel. The consumers need to know whether the fruit comes from within Eretz Yisrael, halachic Eretz Yisrael, or outside halachic Eretz Yisrael. And it's also a very fascinating topic in general to work out what the borders of Eretz Yisrael are and to understand Pshuto Shel Mikra, really the Pshat and the Psukim, about where it's describing us Eretz Yisrael as existing. Now, in Parshat Massei, the Torah presents the most clear delineation of the borders of Eretz Yisrael, really in the whole of Tanakh. And the first thing I want to point out is something that, again, we'll either have time to come back to or not. But if we look at the first couple of psukim in the handout sheet, Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, Saves b'nei Yisrael v'amart aleim, ki atem boim al Eretz Canaan, zos ha'aretz asher tipul lachem menachla, Eretz Canaan legvul Yisrael. What is the land that falls to the Jewish people? What are the borders of Eretz Yisrael? The answer is the land of Canaan. So this is very difficult. Eretz Yisrael, which has intrinsic kedusha, seemingly, intrinsic holiness, and it has halachic status, as discussed, is defined by Canaan, and the coincidences of the geography of the tribes of Canaan and where they happen to live. But this is what the Pasuk says in Pasuk base. What are the borders of the land that you will inherit? The answer is the land which is occupied by Canaan for its borders, for her borders, for the borders of Eretz Canaan. So how can it be that our halachic Eretz Israel has the status of Kedusha, and its halachic status determined by what happened to be occupied by the tribes of Canaan? So there's a number of answers to this question. It could be, as per Sefer Bereshis, each of the 70 ummos, each of the 70 nations, were allocated their own portion of land, and Canaan was allocated the land that would eventually, or was temporarily given the right to occupy, the lands which would eventually become Eretz Israel, and therefore the political borders of Canaan were not coincidental ones, but were ones that were predetermined by this allocated zone or space or country, which at the time was called Eretz Canaan, would eventually become Eretz Israel. So it's almost arranged that Canaan would occupy the area that had the intrinsic Kedushas Oretz. There's a Rashi right at the beginning of the Torah that seems to allude to this, in which Rashi seems to say that Canaan were entrusted with the land as the temporary occupiers of it until Eretz Israel, until Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people would come and clear them out as per the instructions in these psukim and the story of Sefer Yoshua. There is a deeper thought here, which I'm not going to explore in too much depth, which is actually what defines Eretz Israel? What do we mean when we talk about Eretz Israel being a holy land? Is it something existential and intrinsic, or is it something created by us? And maybe Eretz Israel has a flexibility to its definition depending on the times. What would have happened had the first human being to discover monotheism been born in America? Where would Eretz Israel, the Holy Land, then have been? Is it possible that somewhere in North America would have been a region which would have been defined as Eretz Israel? It's related to a similar machlokas about what we mean when we call Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew language, the holy tongue. Is it intrinsically holy, or is it a normal language that was developed and imbued with Kedusha because of how we used it? Languages evolve and develop, and they achieve qualities. So in the 1700s, if you would have wanted to speak philosophy or advanced science, you would have struggled to do so in English. English wasn't a good language to speak philosophy or science then. If you'd have wanted to speak philosophy or science, you'd have spoken in Latin or French, which was a very sophisticated language. English hadn't developed in a manner which allowed one to do it. Move forward to the 21st century, and English is probably the best language in the world to speak about scientific or philosophical contents and concepts, because it's developed and molded into a language which is very good for modernity. If you wish to now use Swahili to speak about modern life and modern scientific and philosophical concepts, you'll struggle because the language simply hasn't developed at the moment in that direction. So the Rambam, at least, is of the view that Lashon HaKodesh is that it was molded through the Nevi'im, through the Torah, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to become a Lashon HaKodesh, to become a holy tongue. But intrinsically, had Avram, had the first human to develop monotheism in the way that Avram did, been born elsewhere, then maybe another language would have been developed into that direction. So this leads us to sort of think about what's the relationship between our input into history and the fundamental, intrinsic, existential kedusha that a land or location has. And therefore it's possible that Eretz Canaan is the land allocated to Klal Yisrael due to where Avram roamed and his experiences, rather than it's initially having a kedusha. It was made fit for purpose through the events that took place there. Either way, the Psukim define and delineate the boundaries of Eretz Israel as per how things developed, as per the practical halacha about what the borders are. Now, Eretz Israel has four sides in the Psukim here in Parshat Pinchas. Two of the sides are pretty clear. Side number one is the west. This is the Mediterranean Sea, not controversial. Side number two is the east, and the core Eretz Israel, also, again, the boundaries are not controversial. It's the Yarden, and at least that part, the bulk of Eretz Israel, from the two seas, from Yam HaMelech up to the Yam HaKneret, is delineated by one very clear river, the Yarden, and we know what that river is. As one gets north and south of these, perhaps it becomes a little less clear, but broadly speaking, the east border is also clear-cut. Let's remember that we do need to go further east because of the lands of Eva Hayarden, the 2.5 tribes that settled on the east bank of the Jordan, as opposed to on the west bank of the Jordan. Again, if we have time, maybe we'll look at that later, but at least core Eretz Yisrael on that side, as per the description in Parshat Massei, is pretty clear cut. We get now to the north and the south, and here the issue really is not clear at all. In the interest of time, I'm not going to focus on all the confusions around this, but we'll just discuss a couple of the interesting halachic points. The first thing, by the way, I should mention is that this is, as far as I've read and understood, this is the first clear delineation of borders in any literature in the world. The concept of borders didn't really exist in the ancient world. Borders come from a very digital perspective, a very on-off perspective. To us in the modern world, it's almost intuitive, the concept of a border. I mean, a country has to end somewhere and a new country has to start somewhere else. And therefore, we're very used to this idea. If I stand a millimeter to the right, then I'm in France. If I stand a millimeter to the left, then I'm in Germany. That there's a line and a dividing line that has to end somewhere. This comes from a very scientific worldview and actually a very halachic worldview. The halacha is fascinated by borders, and halacha has a very clear concept of, an exact boundary determining the halachic status of something. I have 1 crumb less, I haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. 1 crumb more, I've crossed the threshold, I've done the mitzvah. Or the other way around, 1 crumb less and I haven't done the prohibition. 1 crumb more and I've done the prohibition. So we're used to, in the language of Chazal, kol shiur hakachu. This is all the shiurei HaTorah are like that. They're always on off. I have a mikveh. If it has 40 sa and it's kosher, 40 sa minus a kurtov, minus a milliliter of water, it's got less than the required shiur, and therefore it's possible. Borders are come from a similar mindset. Country starts, country finishes. In the ancient world, that wasn't how people thought. It wasn't necessary to think like that because there was a broad region which was always a no man's land between countries. So in the ancient world, there was a thought of Eretz Yisrael is here, Egypt is here, and in between is the desert, which, you wander around. It's not clear exactly who it belongs to, but who really cares, because it doesn't make a difference. No one really is going to rule over that land. But that's not how Torah thinks. In halacha, there's very clear borders. And interestingly, the lines of the borders in the Torah read a bit like the lines drawn by colonial powers in Africa in the past, in which there's sort of these long straight lines. Because basically, when you read through Parshat Massei, the borders do not weave in and out in line with clear geographical features. They're basically lines drawn between 2 points, and a direct line is drawn between them. And one such point is in Pasuk Hey, which will be our first border point that we'll focus on and just discuss some of the lack of clarity. This is a border in the south, and it's described in Nosaf HaGavul Me Atzman. The border shall turn from Atzman, and now you basically draw a straight line from Atzman, Nachala Mitzrayim, towards the Nachal of Egypt. This line goes to the Nachal, the brook or the river of Egypt. Now here we come to an enormous confusion about where Nachal Mitzrayim is and what is being referred to as Nachal Mitzrayim. Traditionally, if you look in our classic sources, interestingly, Nachal Mitzrayim is understood to refer to no less a river than the Nile. Now, if the Nile is the border of Egypt, then we have something very interesting. It means Eretz Yisrael stretches all the way into core Egypt, because the Nile, of course, is central to the oasis, which is Egypt. On either bank of the Nile, you have fertile lands which is built up. Egypt is called Mitzrayim because it's from the word Mitzah, narrow, perhaps because it's a very narrow country in classical world. It's this narrow band of line that winds its way down the bands of land that winds its way down the Nile, with fertile lands on either side. Very difficult to understand the views which are really the classic views, which argue that Nachal Mitzrayim is the Nile. But this view is found in the Targum Yerushalmi. It's found in Rashi in some places. It's found in the Kuzari of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. It's one of the classic ways of understanding this this source. Now, if Nachal Mitzrayim means the Nile, we do need to tweak this a little bit, and it probably doesn't refer to the main body of the Nile. Because interestingly, the term Nachal Mitzrayim is only ever used with reference to the Nile when talking about the borders of Eretz Yisrael. Normally, the term used for the Nile is Yiur. Yiur means river, literally. It means the river, the long river. And this would seem to imply that there's a slight difference between the way the term Nachal Mitzrayim is used and Yiur used for the core body of the Nile, particularly because Eretz Yisrael never extended all the way into Egypt. It didn't extend into the Nile delta at any point. So some have suggested that this refers to one particular arm of the Nile. And again, this dates back really to Rabbi Zobin, the Kuzari, who deals a little bit with this issue. It's known in geography as the Pelusian arm. There was an important city on the eastern edge of Egypt's Nile delta. The delta is, as the Nile arrives near the coast, it begins rather like the Greek letter delta. It sort of triangles out, and you end up with this marshy plain of, as the Nile sort of splits into lots of arms, and the eastmost arm, which is really some way into what we would call the Sinai Peninsula, is next to a city called Pelusium, which has a branch of the Nile, the easternmost branch of the Nile, and that was presumably the arm of the Nile that was being referred to over here, according to the Kuzari. And possibly the reason why this Masorah got lost is because more than 2,000 years ago, that branch of the Nile got choked up with sand, and effectively the Nile stopped flowing into that direction, and therefore got lost. And another reason for assuming that the further west is not Eretz Yisrael is, of course, we know that Moshe didn't manage to go into Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Jews lived in Egypt. They lived throughout the Nile Delta, as far as we understand. Yet Moshe didn't go into Eretz Yisrael. So if Eretz Yisrael stretches all the way to what we would call the Nile, then parts of what seemingly what would be Egypt was where Klal Yisrael lived already in Egypt. And therefore, presumably, this doesn't refer to the main body of the Nile, but refers to the eastern wing of the Nile. I did see, when I was preparing this, that the name Nile is thought, actually, to derive from the word Nachal. Nachal, if you have a sort of Sfardi hey, rather than a heavy ches, but also Nahal, then Nahal and Nile are very similar words. And it seems that the etymology of the word Nile traces back to the Semitic word. The word Nachal is not just found in Hebrew and Lashon HaKodesh, it's in many Semitic languages. And the word Nachal may be the origin of the word Nile. In which case Rashi and the Targum and Rabbi Zobin and others who translate Nachal Mitzrayim, which we would translate as the brook of Egypt, as referring to the Nile of Mitzrayim, may literally be the meaning of the word. I'll just mention here as an aside for those who look into this topic, the Chumash mentions in Shemos, in Perek Yud Gimel, that when they left Egypt, they journeyed past somewhere called Sukkot. And Sukkot is translated into Arabic as El Arish, which means palm huts or something of the sorts. And one finds already in the Gaonim that they identify Nachal Mitzrayim with the Wadi of El Arish. The word Nachal is often taken to mean a wadi. A wadi is a river which only flows in winter or in the rainy season, but not in summer. It's referred to also in the Torah as Kafikim Banegev, the wadis of the desert. In Shir Hamalas, we refer to Mashiach coming as Kafikim Banegev. You're walking along this very barren, dry, deserty track, and you don't realize that in a moment the snows melt or there's a storm much further north, and suddenly the wadi becomes a gushing, fertile river. Unfortunately, this is the cause of death in Israel every year when hikers who don't know what they're doing hike in the riverbank of a wadi, and in moments suddenly it goes from being a dry desert track to a raging river. And we refer to Kafikim Banegev, that Mashiach will come without a moment's notice in such a manner. So Sadigan, who lived around the area, he was born, Sadigan, though he ended up as one of the Gaonim in Bavel, was born initially in Egypt. He links it to the Wadi of El Arish. And this has led to a lot of confusion, because the modern day El Arish is not near where the old El Arish was. The old El Arish area, the Wadi's disappeared, the town has disappeared, it's long gone. and modern day Aloish is significantly further. So again, it's been a little bit lost in time exactly what the boundaries are. In brief, the minimalist picture of Eretz Yisrael is that the north would be located somewhere around the Metula area, which would be in southern Lebanon today, and the south would run somewhere along a line between Beersheba and Gaza in the northern Negev. And the maximalist way of reading the Torah would be that the southern border, as we said, is somewhere deep into the Sinai desert, not as far as the Nile itself, even though, as I said, many Rishonim translate as the Nile, they don't mean the core body in the Nile, but somewhere deep into the Sinai desert, and north, maybe somewhere into northern Syria and Turkey would be the borders of the Torah. Less ink has been spilt about the northern border than the southern border, because it's not really Nogea Halacha L'Maisa, it's not that relevant in practical Halacha, because no one is living in the northern border, no one is living into Lebanon and Syria. I put on the handout sheet a map, which I should give credit to Rabbi Liebtag. In fact, I should credit whole sections of the Shirtim. He helped me understand some of the regions over here. Rabbi Liebtag is a Talmud Chacham who lives in Israel, associated with the Gush Yeshiva, who has a lot of interesting writings on Nach. And I took this map of one of his works, and I printed it here just to show where the border might run. In one model, the pink model, the pink land outlined, you see basically the border going from Beersheba through to Gaza, which is one version of Nachal Harish, which is that it's this is the northernmost version, and then one has the southernmost version, which, as I said, stretches really all the way into the Sinai desert. So this is the Parsha in Pinchas. We now turn to what I labeled in the heading on page 2, Eretz Yisrael 2. A completely separate definition of Eretz Yisrael, and this is the Eretz Yisrael promised to Avraham Avinu in Parshas Lech Lecha at the Bris Bein Abasorim. Now, basically Hashem promises the land to Avraham 3 times. In all custom, he just says, "Go to Eretz Yisrael, al Oretz Asher Areka." At Shechem, he says, "I'll give you Oretz Hazos, this land." In Beis El, he says, "I give you all the land that you can see." And it's really only later in Parshas Lech Lecha when Avram enters into 2 covenants with Hashem, or Hashem enters into 2 covenants with Avram, that things are described a little bit further. And these 2 covenants are the Bris Bein Habasorim and what we call Bris Milah. Now, it's a topic in its own right what a covenant is. But we should be aware that when we talk about a covenant, we're not talking about a small thing. We're talking about a deal between a human being and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is a significant event, and probably what defines the start of the concept of being Jewish. One way of understanding what we mean by being Jewish is that we are B'nai Bris, we are covenantal partners with Hashem. Now, if you look in the Torah, there's a vast array of partnerships that we entered into with Hashem. The whole Torah is a Sefer HaBris, is a partnership document. There's Har Sinai, which is a partnership or a covenant. There's all the way through to in Sefer Devarim, in Avos Moav, in the plains of Moav. But the first 2 uniquely Jewish covenants that were entered into, as opposed to human covenants, are the covenants of Avraham Avinu. Human beings entered into covenants with Hashem, Odom and Noach, but Jewish covenants are Bris Bein Abasorim and Bris Milah, and both times they're associated with different descriptions of what Eretz Yisrael is. Now, the description in the Bris Bein Abasorim I printed in source 2, and this is a vast description. And if we just jump in the interest of time, it's really that all the psukim are relevant, but just in the interest of time, let's jump to Pasuk 18, Pasuk Yud Ches, and here it says, by Yom Ahu, on that day, Koras Hashem Bris, Hashem sealed a covenant, es Avram, with Avram, Leimel Zarach Hanosotis Oretz Hazos, Minna Mitzrayim Adana Godol Nahar Paras, from the river of Egypt all the way to the river Pras, which is the Euphrates River. And then it lists the 10 nations, Keni, Kenizi, etc., Kenoni, 10 nations. Now, here it refers to the Nahar Mitzrayim, the river of Egypt. And about this, there's no machlokas. This clearly is referring to the Nile. And the second river it refers to is Nar Paras, which is the river of Paras, which is the Euphrates River. So this is a vast swathe of land, all the way from the Nile to the Euphrates. Now, it only says that the border stretches from the river of Egypt, from Nar Mitzrayim to Nar Paras. Now, what sort of way is this of talking? You can't give a description of a land which only has two borders. What about the north and south border? And what this would seem to imply is that the Paras, the Euphrates, is functioning not just as an eastern border, but also a northern border, and therefore is making a triangle all the way up into the Euphrates, into Turkey. Because, of course, even though we think of the Euphrates as being downstream in the land that we're familiar with from the story of the journey of Avram, in truth, which leads us into Iraq and that area. In truth, the Euphrates stretches all the way up to the southern edge of Turkey, right at the top of Syria. Hence, the second picture which I show over here, in which this border of Eretz Israel is really a large diagram, a large triangle. It stretches from Nar Mitzrayim, which is shown in the river as the Nile, far beyond the Sinai Peninsula, all the way up to the Nile, deep into Egypt, and then going along to the Euphrates, which acts as both the northern and eastern border, and then of course you have the sea as the again as the western border. So this is a vast amount of land and a completely different description of Eretz Israel. How do we combine these two borders of Eretz Israel, the Eretz Israel of Parshat Massei, which we just read, and the Eretz Israel of the promised Avram? So Rashi answers this question, and he says that this is a much bigger Eretz Israel, which will only be given to us when Moshiach comes. This isn't, actually Rashi doesn't say this, he says, Asidim liyos Yerusha la'osid. This will eventually be our inheritance in the future. This isn't the land that was given to Eretz Israel when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel. So basically, when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, they were given the lands of the 7 nations, the 7 people of Canaan, which is the description in Massei. But eventually we're promised a greater Israel, which is the one that stretches between the 2 rivers. Now, I don't have time to go into this in detail, but what's this telling us? I mean, what is this idea of a greater Eretz Israel and a more minimalistic Eretz Israel? So I'll simply, in the time available, take us to back to Lech Lecha again, to the second bris which is made with Avraham Avinu. And this is the Bris Milah. And here, the lands promised Avraham Avinu, if we look in source 3, sounds much more like the lands of Pinchas. Because look in Pasuk 8, here Hashem promises Avraham, I will give you and your seeds after you, Eretz Mugarecha, the lands of your sojournings, which isn't this vast amount of land. It's what is it? As Kol Eretz Canaan, the lands of Canaan, L'chuzas Olam, to be an achuzah forever. V'yisilahem le'elokim, and I'll be for you as a god. So the lands of the Bris Milah is back to the lands of Eretz Israel. And we don't have time to go into this in detail, but the language used in Bris Milah is a very different language to the language used in the Bris Bein Abasorim. As we explained, a bris is really a two-way covenant, and the Bris Milah is a covenant between Elokim and Avram, and what's promised to Avram is an achuzah. What's promised to Avram is achuzah is a land holding, a personal plot, promised to him by Elokim, who is the personal God, the God that we relate to and connect to and form a covenant with. The land in the Bris Bein Abasorim is a covenant HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes with Yud Kei Vav Kei, and that's referred to as a Yerusha. Even though in modern Ivrit and currently spoken sort of Yiddish Hebrew, we refer to Yerusha as an inheritance, in the language of the Torah, the Horashtem is always referred to as conquest. So basically we see there's 2 regions that are discussed over here. There's the borders of Massei, which are also Eretz Mugarecha, described in the covenant of the Bris Milah, more or less between Beersheva in the south and Don in the north, which is the source of Midon Va'ad Beersheva. Avram chases at the time of the battle with the 4 kings and the 5 kings, he chases his enemies as far north as Don. And that refers to Avram's personal connection to Eretz Yisrael. Almost 2 types of Kedusha going on over here. There's the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, referred to as the sort of national mission of the Jewish people, which is the Bris Bein HaBesarim, which is this big sweeping prophecy about the future fate of Klal Yisrael. And then there's the personal achuzah, direct relationship which we'll have with Eretz Yisrael, which is the relationship that we've had on our own personal connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the mokum of our religious experience and our avodah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is described in the smaller Eretz Yisrael of Pinchas and the Bris Milah, and the connection that we got with Eretz Yisrael immediately in our current times. Now, just one way of understanding this idea is that the 2 rivers in our thinking have significance. One way of picturing the whole Torah, and in many ways the whole of Nach, is our Eretz Yisrael's relationship to 2 big rivers, the River Nile and the Euphrates. If you think about the Torah, the Chamishi Chumshi Torah, it's really a story of travels around 2 rivers. The first story, which deals with all the way up to Yaakov Avinu, is the travels backwards and forwards of the Avos along the Euphrates River. So Avram starts of his life in Iraq, goes up through to North Turkey, and then down effectively the first part of the famous Fertile Crescent. He goes along the Euphrates, through Iraq, through Bavel, and into down through Syria and back into Eretz Yisrael. Avram's life is a story of a journey from the center of one civilization through to Eretz Yisrael. Then the Avos go backwards and forwards. Eliezer goes backwards and forwards. Yaakov goes backwards and forwards to his uncle Lavan, and that's the story of one journey. Then we come to the second half of the journey. And the second half of the journey is a travel backwards and forwards to the Nile. You have Yaakov going down to Mitzrayim, obviously following Yosef, and then the rest of the Torah is a story about their journey back from the center of civilization to Eretz Yisrael. And what this is telling us is something more profound than just a piece of geography. It's telling us that we have a small land of our own Eretz Yisrael, and we need to make that our own civilization. And we're always struggling to find the balancing act between the 2 magnetic poles, the 2 centers of gravity, these 2 large empires and civilizations and dynamic cultures, one of which is to the south of Eretz Yisrael, the Nile, and the other one which is to the north and to the west of Eretz Yisrael, and to the east of Eretz Yisrael, which is the civilization along the banks of the Euphrates. And if you learn the rest of Nach, it's always about battles going on between these 2 directions. Eretz Yisrael is always struggling to achieve independence from these 2 big powers. And it's not just political and military, it's conceptually. Our struggle is to not be sucked in to these 2 disparate civilizations, each of which represent a threat to what we are, but to remain our own independent entity, not just politically and militarily, but in terms of our consciousness as Jews. Indeed, one way of describing the advent of Mashiach is Abohu Ovdim Me'eretz Ashur, Vanidochim Me'eretz Mitzrayim. There are people who are lost in Ashur and people who are lost in Mitzrayim, and we need to gravitate towards Eretz Yisrael at the center. And therefore, one way of understanding what Rashi means when he says that the Bris Bein HaBesarim, which is not the personal religious covenant of Avram, which is the Bris Milah, but the national historical covenant of Avram with Hashem, with Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is the Bris Bein HaBesarim, it refers to this greater Eretz Yisrael. This is an Eretz Yisrael that one day we will achieve our aim. It will be able to stretch from the Nile to the Euphrates. And as Eretz Yisrael will be able to find its place between these 2 entities and reach up to their borders. But until that point, the Eretz Yisrael we have is only the smaller Eretz Yisrael described in Parshas Pinchas. There is a third Eretz Yisrael, the Eretz Yisrael of Olei Bavel, the returnees from the exile of the first Beis HaMikdash. And this is in some ways the most important Eretz Yisrael of all in terms of practical halacha, because that's what defines the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael in terms of Trumas and Maestros. But for today, we've run out of our time on the Parsha, and therefore I'm going to stop there. And Emir Hashem, you're all invited back for this time next year, Parshat Massei, when we will look at the third of the definitions of the lands of Israel and what defines Eretz Yisrael from that point of view. So I'll stop there for today. These are the 2 Eretz Yisraels that we covered. So we covered 2/3 of our mission statements for this week. And Emir Hashem will look at the third Eretz Yisrael on another occasion. But these are certainly the 2 Eretz Yisraels referred to in Tanakh. The third one is a post-biblical Eretz Yisrael, or right at the end of Nach, in Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, the return of the Olei Bavel, when they only had a much smaller rump state rather than the expanded land of Israel. So I'll stop now on the Parsha, and we will try today to finish off the halachas of Kotev, of writing on Shabbos. Now, 2 weeks ago, and I think 3 weeks ago, we discussed the halachas of Kotev, of writing, in terms of actual writing on Shabbos. But then we shifted into the drabbanons associated with Kotev, and I discussed last week commercial transactions, which are rabbinically prohibited for several reasons. One is a gzeira, because when one does a commercial transaction, one often comes to write. And the second is general dabedova, the psukim that we mentioned last time. On Shabbos, one should engage in Shabbostic activities and Shabbos-appropriate activities. And this is, therefore, transactions and commerce is forbidden on Shabbos. So these intertwine into sort of one set of drabbanons, even though they're discrete halachas, really. Now, last week we discussed giving presents on Shabbos and commercial transactions. This week I want to discuss another set of halachas which are known as Shabbos, profiting on Shabbos. And I'll start off with a riddle, which is why is it more problematic for an expert Baal Korah to lay in on Shabbos than a regular Baal Korah to lay in on Shabbos? And in a few moments I'll answer that riddle. But we'll move back now to what is Sechar Shabbos. Sechar Shabbos means any earnings achieved on Shabbos, specifically on Shabbos. What would be examples of that? Payments for work that I do on Shabbos, even when it's perfectly mutter work on Shabbos, even when it's allowed work on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, I'm allowed to babysit. There's no malach in babysitting. I'm allowed to be a Baal Korah or a Baal Tefillah, a Chazan or a Lena. I'm allowed to be a Rav and be paid for giving a drosha on Shabbos. I'm allowed to make profit on Shabbos, seemingly. If I have money sitting in the bank account, I can accrue interest on Shabbos. If I rent out property, I can receive rental on Shabbos. None of these involve malacha on Shabbos. Nonetheless, all of them are potentially also, since I'm receiving Sechar Shabbos, money by dint of things that I do on Shabbos or just the passage of time on Shabbos. So, how does this play out? What are the halachas that are relevant over here? And the first thing is, as per the halacha, money received specifically for Shabbos, for an action I've done on Shabbos, for work I've done on Shabbos, even mutter work on Shabbos, like babysitting or laning, all money achieved just by dint of the passage of time of Shabbos, such as interest given from the bank just for Shabbos, in principle is also on Shabbos, other than certain exceptions that we're going to outline over here. So Chazal used, they forbade Sechar Shabbos because this was drawing perilously near commerce on Shabbos, even though in these cases what I'm doing is not actually a commercial transaction, but underlying it is a commercial transaction. I have my money earning interest, I have my property rented out, I'm being paid for a job I do. When I get paid for things, normally one makes a contract, a shtar, and therefore this is forbidden because of the gzeira of Kosev, of writing on Shabbos, or because of the prohibition of doing commerce on Shabbos. What are the exceptions? When can one allowed to do so? And the answer is Chazal allowed it when there is something called havla, when the Shabbos fee is swallowed up in a beyond Shabbos payment. So let's just discuss some examples of this. If the remuneration I receive is absorbed, havla means lahavliya, to absorb, is absorbed in weekday payment, then, in other words, contractually combined with payment which I receive, not just for Shabbos, but also non-Shabbos work, then this would be allowed. So, for example, if a babysitter is asked, can you babysit for us twice this week, on Tuesday and on Shabbos? And she says, fine, for that job I will charge £15, then that's mutter, because she's not just charging for Shabbos, she's charging for the combined job, which includes Shabbos and non-Shabbos time. And this is one of the heterim, one of the ways that the babysitter can be paid for Shabbos, if she receives payment for a combined job, not just of Shabbos, but of a weekday role also. Now, this can't be a joke, this has to be genuine. Meaning to say, that's the terms of the conditions, that's the terms of the contract. And therefore, if the employer backs out and changes their mind after Tuesday and says, or after Shabbos, doesn't matter which one came first. So if she agrees to work on Tuesday plus Shabbos or Shabbos plus Tuesday, and after one job they back out, nonetheless, they're still contractually obliged to pay for both because they agreed to a combined package deal and she started the job already. If I book a babysitter and then need to cancel, as long as I haven't specified otherwise, normally speaking, I can cancel because she hasn't yet started the job. However, if I cancel once the babysitter has started the job, then he can claim off me the babysitting fees because they've started the job already. Therefore, if I employ for a double act of Shabbos and weekday, I have to pay if they've already started the job for the combined roles. It has to be a genuine relationship. What are other examples of havla? Well, many. If I receive interest from the bank, now I receive the interest from the bank in many bank accounts on a daily basis. If I receive them on a monthly basis, no problem at all, because it's a monthly interest rate. Havla, Shabbos is swallowed up in a general payment of interest, therefore it's not a problem. What happens if I receive daily interest rates? So there's also a havla, because the bank pays for Saturday, and Shabbos is not synonymous with Saturday. So the Friday interest payments include some Shabbos, that's true, but it also includes some Friday. And the Shabbos interest payments include some Shabbos, but also some Motzi Shabbos, because even in summer, Motzi Shabbos goes out at 10:30, 11 o'clock, but Saturday ends at 12 o'clock, and therefore I'm receiving the interest for a time beyond Shabbos itself. We'll come to other examples of bank interest momentarily. What happens if I want to rent a property? Well, normally speaking, the property is rented on a weekly or monthly basis, and again, it wouldn't be a problem. If it's rented on a daily basis, such as a hotel room, then again, the hotel room would have to be rented for a time period that includes not just Shabbos, but also extra Shabbos time, perhaps timing it for Saturday, and that would have to be worked out. The halachas of hotel keeping are complicated. I'm not going to go into them now, but as is well known, there are from people who own hotels, and they would have to consider schar Shabbos and how to deal with that. What happens for a chazan, a bal korah, a rav, who gets paid for Shabbos work? Well, in many cases, again, havla applies. They are paid for Shabbos work, but they're also paid for weekday work. So a rav is employed with Shabbos in the weekday, so this would be allowed. A chazan maybe is generally employed only for Shabbos and Yom Tov, but maybe also has some weekday responsibilities, perhaps at weddings or perhaps on salichas and things like that. And therefore, again, the chazan is employed on a contract which includes Shabbos and weekday. However, what about a bal korah? A bal korah is employed, perhaps a shul that needs to pay a bal korah, doesn't have its own homegrown talent, and they pay £30, £50 per Shabbos for someone to walk over to their community and learn on Shabbos. And this is a pure Shabbos job. Why would there not be an issue of schar Shabbos there? And the answer is it depends whether the person is an expert bal korah or not. If they are non-expert bal korah, then they are receiving their money for preparing the laning, not just for the laning itself, and therefore the payment they receive isn't just for the job on Shabbos, but it's for the whole package deal, which involves the preparation that they make before Shabbos. However, there are expert bal korah that prepare for their laning Friday night after their meal. They casually open their tikkun and they do a quick run through a couple of times, and they don't need to do any more preparation than that, or perhaps they don't even prepare at all. And in such a situation, then there would potentially be schar Shabbos because they're just being paid for Shabbos itself rather than weekday work. So this is the heter of havla. I'll mention a couple of interesting scenarios connected to this. One scenario is money received daily from the bank with bank interest. Now, as I mentioned, normally it's not a problem because of Shabbos includes weekday. Saturday interest payments includes weekday interest payment. However, what happens when I have 2 days Yom Tov? So in 2 days Yom Tov, there is a full 24-hour block, which is in Yom Tov. How can I receive interest for my bank payment? So on this, Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva, and he says it's not a problem because Mimon of Shach, I know that one of these 2 days isn't really Yom Tov. We have to keep 2 days Yom Tov in Chutz Haaretz. We treat both as Yom Tov out of the Sveika D'Yoma, the doubt of the day. But when it comes to the interest rate, the interest is for a period which includes both day 1 and day 2. And therefore, either way, there must be one time period which isn't Yom Tov, and therefore this is permissible. What happens, though, when I have a 3-day Yom Tov, or a 2-day Yom Tov where one of them is Shabbos and one of them is Yom Tov? In that situation, it is correct that there is a problem with schar Shabbos. And therefore, in principle, one should not take the money that one receives as interest in this setup, because there is no havla, and I've earned money on Shabbos and Yom Tov in an impermissible manner. However, there's no solution to this. Even though banks take our money when we don't want them to take it, they refuse to take money when we do want them to take it. And therefore, if you write a letter to your bank and try and explain to them the halachas of schar Shabbos and havla, and tell them that on 2-day Yom Tovs or Yom Tov that it falls on a Friday or a Sunday, you don't wish to receive interest, they will not know how to handle it. They don't have the algorithms and computing power to work that out. They know how to charge you £30 for a letter and 36% for overdrafts, but they don't know how to take back interest for one day. And therefore, they won't be able to take the money back. And you end up in a situation where, b'di'evet, you have received Schar Shabbos, and there's nothing you could do about it. What should you do with Schar Shabbos that you received by mistake? So you made a mistake, or there's nothing you could do. So the majority opinion is you can keep it, you don't have to be concerned. Ramosha brings the minority opinion that says you shouldn't accept Schar Shabbos, even in that case, and he says you should do a rough calculation and give money to tzedakah anonymously for any money you've received in such a setup, which is prohibited from Schar Shabbos. He says people donate tzedakah anonymously, hopefully throughout the year, and therefore you should have in mind that whatever percentage of money you received in breach of the halacha of Schar Shabbos, because you have nothing you could do about it, should be given to tzedakah. But as far as core halacha is concerned, since Schar Shabbos is mutter b'di'evet, and there's no way of avoiding this Schar Shabbos, this wouldn't be a problem. This would be allowed. So this is one interesting example of Schar Shabbos. A second scenario of Schar Shabbos, which is quite relevant, is people who have automated businesses that run on Shabbos. Now, in the good old days, this was discussed by the poskim in the scenario of people who had what they called vending machines. So people owned vending machines which used to run on Shabbos, and the question was, could they keep their vending machine going on Shabbos? Nowadays, this is often asked, I've been asked this several times, that by people who have websites which run on Shabbos. Are they allowed to let the website stay open on Shabbos and do commerce for them on Shabbos? So what would be the potential problems over here? The first problem is the vending machine is doing work for you on Shabbos, as is the website. Not an issue, because it's working automatically. This is no worse than a Shabbos clock, which does things for you. We don't paskin that there's a prohibition of shvisas kelim. As far as Torah is concerned, the fact that your lights are going on and off isn't a problem because the Shabbos clock is doing it. But there's a second problem over here. We've already explained you're not allowed to do mekach or memka. You're not allowed to do buying and selling on Shabbos, and your website or your vending machine is buying and selling things for you on Shabbos. And again, this isn't a problem because we find in halacha that a transaction can occur on your behalf on Shabbos or Yom Tov. You are not allowed to do transactions on Shabbos or Yom Tov. However, an automated transaction or one which is done on your behalf can happen on Shabbos or Yom Tov. So, for example, if someone has a non-Jewish agent who they send to the market to buy and sell on their behalf, you're not allowed to specifically instruct them to do so on Shabbos. However, if you just give them money and let them get on with the job and buy and sell for you whenever they want to, they're allowed to do so on Shabbos, and you don't have to instruct them not to do so, because work happening on your behalf, they didn't forbid passive transactions, they only forbade active transactions. And therefore, again, the vending machine or the website wouldn't be a problem. What about Schar Shabbos, though? The fact is, I am earning money on Shabbos through the website or the vending machine. And the answer is, again, this isn't a problem. And the reason here is because this isn't Schar Shabbos. Schar Shabbos refers to something I'm receiving for a service or work that I'm doing linked to the time of Shabbos. I'm doing it on Shabbos. Or it refers to the passage of time of Shabbos itself. In this case, neither happens. I'm selling an object. I'm selling a good. Selling a good, the money received for selling a good, even though that took place on Shabbos, wouldn't be a problem, and therefore, again, there wouldn't be an issue of the website making money for you on Shabbos. The final question would be that of Zilzal Shabbos, respect for Shabbos, and therefore it is correct that a company which is associated with a Jew and with a Jewish service should not stay open on Shabbos because of Zilzal Shabbos. However, a company which is anonymous wouldn't be a problem. So if you have a website that trades on Amazon, and your trading name is Yankee Cohen, then it is inappropriate to keep it open on Shabbos. However, if it is a more anonymous website, even though someone who digs through the company files could work out that it's Jewish owned, there wouldn't be a problem because there's no issa of this taking place on Shabbos. A website which is uniquely associated with a Jewish organization, a yeshiva website, or an online Sforim bookseller, or something like that, should close on Shabbos because it's also on Shabbos, but for everyone else, there's no reason not to keep the website open on Shabbos. So this is another halacha in Schar Shabbos. There is a machlokas about Schar Shabbos for a mitzvah. For example, again, this gets us back to the Baal Korah. Maybe there's an allowance for Baal Korah or Baal Tefillah to accept payment because they're doing working for a mitzvah. A doctor or a nurse who treats someone on Shabbos, maybe accepting payment because of the mitzvah that's done. And this is, again, a discussion amongst the poskim, is this lechatz chila or not? So is it lechatz chila for someone who performs work on Shabbos, which is for a mitzvah, to take such payment? And therefore it's certainly more lechatz chila in a case where there's also the allowance of havlah, in other words, it's swallowed up by weekday activity, as we previously explained. So these are some of the examples of schar Shabbos, which is a whole separate, as I explained, a whole separate takana, gezerah midrabanan, linked to the prohibition of business on Shabbos, linked to the prohibition of kosev, of writing on Shabbos. This is relevant, by the way, sometimes. What other cases are relevant is making something hefker on Shabbos would be a problem based on this also. So someone, for example, realizes that they own chometz on Shabbos, Erev Pesach, then declaring something hefker would also be included in this prohibition. Okay, so this is another, the Rabbanon, as I said, linked to Kosev. In the time available, maybe I'll just speak about a couple more of the Rabbanons, which are linked to the Malacha of Kosev. And one of these are, another set of Rabbanons linked to this is measuring and weighing on Shabbos. We are aware that we're not allowed in general to measure and weigh on Shabbos. And the reason for this prohibition is again a Rabbanon, linking these activities to writing on Shabbos. When one measures and weighs, one normally does so in a scenario in which one is acting in a surveying manner, one's trying to work out quantities. It's very common to write down measurements and weights as one does this in order to record what one is measuring and weighing, and therefore midrabanan, measuring and weighing is prohibited. What are examples of these? So just running through scenarios of this. Someone who wants to measure food for preparing food. So maybe it's Yom Tov and someone's doing cooking or baking, which one's allowed to do on Yom Tov, or it's just measuring out portions for food or something like that. One isn't allowed to weigh or measure these food items. However, one can rely on an estimate when it's a casually achieved estimate, even if there are indicators to help one make their measure more accurate. So since it's common to use a marked measuring cup as a method of distributing things, someone can fill food in a measuring cup as long as they're not sort of weighing it up and looking exactly on the line and doing an active measure. They're allowed to use a measuring cup and they know what the quantities are in the measuring cup. A scale you wouldn't be allowed to use because there's no normal way of using a scale. A measuring cup people use the whole time, and if you happen to know the quantity of the measuring cup, there's no specific actor which is prohibited, and therefore if someone is concerned about not being able to do the measures, they could use a measuring cup to measure this. One's not allowed to weigh oneself on Shabbos for this reason, so if one is dieting and taking a daily weighing, one wouldn't be allowed to do this on Shabbos. There's a very interesting discussion, a fascinating discussion in the poskim about measuring time on Shabbos. Measuring time, we may think of as measuring, but it's a little different really to measuring quantities. Time is an abstract entity. It's not the classic measuring where you're measuring an actual physical, tangible object in front of one. One's measuring the passage of time. So the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, was unsure about measuring time. The Ramah, Ramoshe Isilis, who paskins for Ashkenazim, was sure, and he says that one shouldn't measure time on Shabbos. Now, how does one measure time on Shabbos? And this doesn't involve using a watch, because a watch doesn't measure the passage of time. It simply tells you what the time is. Now, you can look at the time now, and you can look at the time in a minute later, and you can work out from that that a minute of time has passed. So the only case really where you actually measure time is with a sand timer or an hourglass or that sort of thing, where you're actually measuring a length of time rather than just checking what the time is now and what the time is later. So this would be measuring time, which wouldn't be allowed. However, I don't really know any scenarios where one does this in a prohibited manner. The most common use nowadays, as far as I know, of sand timers is in games. So there's various games that one can play in which you want to measure time, and you'll use a sand glass to let each player have their fixed amount of time before you move on to the next player. Now, again, in this case, I believe this is mutter, because you're not measuring time in that case, you're simply ensuring that everyone has an equal amount of time. You don't have a particular interest. You may not even know how long the sand timer is measuring. It may be a half-minute sand timer or a 45-second sand timer or a minute sand timer. You don't really know, you don't really care. It's simply a way of ensuring that the game is played in an equitable manner, that everyone has the same amount of time, and therefore you agree the amount of time it takes for the sand or the salt to fall, it would pass. So I don't think in the modern era there's particularly a way to transgress this prohibition. other than one case which I'll share in a moment. But generally speaking, we don't use sand timers to measure time nowadays. We use watches to measure time, and that's not measuring time, it's simply looking at the time. And we only use sand timers in the context of a game when we're not really measuring a length of time. The one case where sand timers might be an issa is a case someone told me, actually a difficult halachic case. It was someone who, if I remember the case correctly, it was someone who needed to have shiurim on Yom Kippur. And I'm not going to go through now the halachic complications of ill health, where someone is unable to fast, and they can eat every few minutes. The length of the time depends on the medical conditions. I'm again not going to discuss times here, but in this particular case, they asked me whether they could use a sand timer to measure the amount of time between each eating. One of the difficulties of shiurim is measuring the amount of time and so on, and they wanted to use a sand timer to measure. So this would be a classic example of what the Ramah was speaking about, where you are actually using a sand timer to measure time, because they were there interested in the amount of time that passed. But yet again, this would be mutter. And the reason it would be mutter is because it would be measuring the tzorech mitzvah, and for the sake of their health. And therefore, there's a double reason why this is mutter. One is allowed to measure for the sake of health, and one is allowed to measure for the sake of a mitzvah. So this halacha of measuring time is almost unheard of nowadays, but it's still an interesting halachic discussion to understand why it never really ends up being a concern. The other example of measuring which we do for a mitzvah is shiurim of matzah and morah on Pesach. I'm not again going to go through now the issues of shiurim and what size shiurim one needs and so on, and to what degree one should or shouldn't measure these things, and that's a whole complex subject of what a gazayis means, which is its own interesting halachic issue. But many people have the practice of measuring on a sheet or the like what size of morah or matzah they should use, and again this would be allowed because of measuring time on, and because of measuring for a mitzvah, and that would be allowed. I just want to use the last few minutes available for just running through a few more examples of when drabonons of Kotev would apply. Midrabanon, they ushered using a checklist scenario on Shabbos or Yom Tov. So a caterer, for example, or a professional host who has lots of guests coming and wants to tick off or check when each guest comes. Chazal were worried that they would literally tick off the arrival of the guests, and again this would be a problem. Similarly, if someone is catering and has lists of food and allocations of food, again that's a sort of checklist where Chazal were worried that you would edit it on Shabbos by changing one of your menu plans or checklisting, and this would be a problem. This doesn't really apply in normal host situations at home, because normally speaking, the number of guests, one's using the checklist to remind oneself just of the number of guests, and not a situation where it's literally a checklist which would be included in the parameters of the drabanon. However, if one is hosting a large-scale function, one should be aware of this halacha and take it into account. There are two solutions to this, which is get someone who isn't the host to check the list. The takana drabanon, the rabbinical prohibition, was only made for the host who were worried to change it, not for someone else. Or use the list without reading. Chazal said if one's just scanning the list but not reading it aloud, then again it's mutter. And the logic behind this is that at the end of the day, this is a drabanon. They wanted one to remember not to write down, and therefore as long as one did it in this manner, where one's reminding oneself constantly that this is Shabbos, they weren't concerned with one writing it down. So this is another example of these drabonons. Other drabonons associated with the prohibition of commerce on Shabbos are reading newspapers, the business column in newspapers, if one's checking how one's investments are doing. So you want to look up the index, the FTSE index in the newspaper to check how your investments are doing. If you are scanning the property section of a newspaper, because you're interested in finding out what the latest crazy prices that property is going for in Northwest London, and it's just an interest, that would be mutter. If you're looking because you're considering buying and therefore you have a commercial interest, then that would be osa. And so with other things, if you enjoy looking through, I don't know if they print it anymore, but they used to print the Argos catalogue, and it's probably all online nowadays. If you enjoy looking through catalogues just because you want to keep up to date with the latest fashion, then that would be mutter. If you're looking through the catalogue because you're considering buying something, that would be osa. These are all examples of things which aren't allowed on Shabbos because of commerce. One final halacha on Shabbos, which I'll finish with, is there's various halachic transactions and the like which aren't allowed on Shabbos. One isn't allowed to have a din Torah on Shabbos, a court case on Shabbos, because again, it's very usual that in a court case one ends up writing the records of the court case. And similarly, a get, a divorce document, and a marriage a siddur or kedushin can't be conducted on Shabbos because of issues with them being normal to write on Shabbos, and therefore one shouldn't do so on Shabbos. I'll tell you, and I'll conclude with an interesting story of a marriage that did take place on Shabbos. Normally, as I said, we can't do a marriage on Shabbos because of this Rabbanon of Kotev. There was a story that occurred in Bnei Brak a couple of years ago. I happened to read this in one of the newspapers, and it hit me as an interesting halachic story. And the story was as follows: a young man who had just got married on, let's say, Wednesday, was walking home from shul Shabbos morning, and he was going to pick up his color and then head off to their Sheva Brachos. It was still in their Sheva Brachos week. And he was chatting to his friends on the way home from shul, and he mentioned to his friend that something interesting had happened. He said as follows: he says, it's an interesting thing, but at the wedding we discovered that I had brought the wrong ring had been delivered by the jeweler, and I complained to the jeweler straight after the wedding, and he told me, don't worry, give the ring back and I'll switch it for the right ring. And his friends panicked, and he said, well, it turns out then that the ring you used for the marriage was not your ring, and therefore the kedushin was not chal, the wedding did not take effect, because the ring you gave your, at the time, fiancée, who has since you thought became your wife, but in fact hasn't become your wife, because you didn't give her a ring on that was yours, you gave her the ring that belonged to the company, because the company gave you the wrong ring. So this was a nightmare situation, because it turns out he's not married. He obviously will need to arrange a marriage as soon as possible. He wants to do so discreetly. It's very embarrassing. But how can he now turn up at his Sheva Brachos and let the Sheva Brachos take place when in fact he's not married? You can't have a Sheva Brachos with 7 brachos that are said. These would be brachos of Atala, and he's going to have to tell all the guests, sorry, you have to go home because we're not legally halachically married. Terrible embarrassment. What can they do? So they rushed to the basin of Rav Nissim Kareditz, and Rav Nissim Kareditz said, I will arrange a wedding for you here on the spot. And they did a wedding Shabbos morning. He brought in 2 witnesses, and he gave his color an item of value that he did own. And through that, they did a wedding on the spot, and therefore he could go back off to the Sheva Brachos without telling anyone that the original wedding had been a mess up. And the basis of this heter was extreme embarrassment. And Nissim Kareditz's view was that this Rabbanon would be waived in a situation of extreme embarrassment. And his source for this Pesach was another wedding that took place on Shabbos. And this was in Krakow, back in the times of the Ramah. So we're talking about the 1500s. And there was a wedding in those days. Weddings used to take place on Fridays. They used to do weddings on Fridays in order to have the suda of the wedding party, Friday night, in combination with the Shabbos meal to save money. Because people were poor, desperately poor, and they couldn't afford a double meal of a Shabbos meal and a wedding suda, and therefore they would use the same one for both. Now this particular wedding got delayed. The reason it got delayed was because of events that unfortunately take place sometimes in weddings. There was a row between the two sides, or perhaps the chassan or kala got cold feet, and the wedding was delayed and delayed and delayed until just after sunset, by the time they got to peace. And the Ramah was the Masata Kedushin, and were they at that point, the Ramah to say it's Shabbos now, I'm sorry, we have to delay the wedding until Sunday, all the guests would have gone, it would have been terribly embarrassing, it would have created yet again tension, who knows if they'll fall out again in the meantime. Each side would blame the other side for being such akshonim, such stubborn people, and delaying the wedding until this point, and it would have restarted the whole row again. It would have been an absolute disaster, and therefore the Ramah officiated at this wedding on a Friday night, even though Shabbos had started, based upon this halacha that this Rabbanon can be waived in situations of extreme embarrassment, and therefore this was a source for Rav Nissim Kareditz's Pesach to allow this wedding to take place on Shabbos morning in Bnei Brak, as I said, in the case where it turns out that the ring that the chassan gave his color was not his own ring. So I mention all this here simply to say that a wedding normally is not done on Shabbos, and the reason if someone ever asks you in the future, why is a wedding not done on Shabbos? The answer is, what do you mean you're not allowed to write on Shabbos? That's the source of the prohibition to have a wedding on Shabbos. I'll conclude there, other than mentioning that someone has posted on the group saying a sand timer to measure time for boiling an egg on Yom Tov. Would that also be included? And thank you. You posted the message anonymously, so I don't know if you want me to mention your name, but you know who you are. Thank you for mentioning that. That's an excellent example. A sand timer used to boil an egg, where you are interested there in measuring the passage of time. That would indeed be prohibited according to the Ramah, but not according to the Shulchan Aruch. According to Shulchan Aruch, it would be allowed. For Ashkenazim, it wouldn't be allowed because the Ramah is of the view that measuring time is included in this Rabbanon. So I'll conclude there. And next week, we will start the twin malacha of Kotev, which is moichik, a raising on Shabbos. And I wish you all a good day, a good week, and thank you so much, as always, for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very much.